Hello everyone, today we talk about the Roman supply ladder of the Classis Flavia Moesiaca, roughly around the time of the Roman invasion of Dacia. This video is about the ship type. It's a supply ladder, a supplying ship, a cargo fundamentally. But it's important to spend a couple of words at least about the classes. Nothing in ultra depth, just having the chronological and geographical coordinates. The Flavian fleet of Moesia, or Moesia if you prefer, was essentially the Roman Empire's fleet on the lower Danube below the Narrows known as the Iron Gates, that series of gorges and rapids located along the course of the Danube between present-day Romania and Serbia. And these natural barriers were important for the Roman conquest of Dacia. We will see now why. Essentially, the below, downstream from Singidunum, but specifically the Iron Gates, the Classis Moesiaca patrolled the Danube outside the winter months because in those the Danube regularly freezes, so makes navigation impossible. The Classis was established sometime between 20 BC and 10 AD. Right, we find it operating since the end of the 1st century BC. It was based in Noviodunum, the ruins of which are to be found near the modern Romanian town of Izatria in the Tulcea country in northern Dobruja. So in the actual northeasternmost at least Balkan part of the empire. From Noviodunum, the Classis Moesiaca controlled not just the lower Danube from the Iron Gates, but the northwestern Black Sea as far as Crimea, the Chersonesus. So it had actually a wide strategic relevance, not just the one that it would acquire naturally in a particular way during Trajan's invasion and conquest of Dacia. We will see now what the supply ladders in fact were for. It's really normal not to know when the first Roman troops began to operate on the river. It's clear again that from the end of the 1st century BC, the imperial forces were already there. Anyhow, a more consistent fortification system was established along the lower Danube in the time of Vespasian. We are between 69 and 79 AD. I made recently a video about Vespasian, and we talked, in fact, also about his foreign policy, his Danubian strategy. He was the first guy to engage against Dacia. If he had not been assassinated, he would have probably mounted up the kind of expedition that eventually Trajan did, and so this region was becoming ever more relevant from a military point of view, and generally speaking, the empire was beginning to fortify more, to protect the frontier in a more structured fashion. We know, however, that already in 50 AD, the Marcomannic prince Vannius had given himself up to a Roman fleet on the Danube. This was because of issues in Germany. The guy was about to be overthrown, and he passed over to the Romans in this circumstance, and that's where it happened, where the Danubian fleet was involved. Right? We know that the Classis Moesiaca was certainly in existence by the year of the 4 emperors, just like the Pannonian fleet upstream, and this is the reason why it would get, in fact, with the victory of Vespasian, the title Flavia from the imperial gens, marking its adherence to the victors. Given the rise of the hostilities between the Romans and the Dacians, the Iron Gates in particular formed very important strategic location, as they constituted a natural barrier between the two powers in controlling trade and military movements along the same river. It was difficult, given the steep cliffs and narrow passes of the Iron Gates, to invade with an army penetrating into Dacia. Thus, the same, like, depending on who was, it was true also for the other side, like the Dacians wanted to attack Moesia, as they did, right? In any case, contending there was quite crucial. The Danube River was a major transportation route for both peoples, and as we will see now, the supplies are connected with this wall, not just during the campaign, but in general to help, like, the Roman military also after the occupation of Dacia. The steady flow of resources and revenue from the province was necessary to support just the military in loco. We've never talked about this much, right? Roman logistics is sort of, it may sound strange, but it's underrated as a topic of discussion in general. Everybody knows that, of course, the Romans were advanced at that, to say the least, but when it gets to the details, right, that's why I also make this videos. By the way, by Novio Duunum, some vexillationes of the Legio Quincta Macedonica were detached, at least until the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Then followed the vexillationes of the Legio Prima Italica, and then from the, later on, the Diocletian Legio Prima Iovia. But we will look at late Roman riverine warfare in another video. During the Dacian Wars, the Emperor Trajan constructed a towpath and a canal to allow navigation through the Iron Gate. Right? A towpath is a path or road alongside a canal or river that was used by horses or other draft animals to tow boats and barges along the waterway. Right? So this allowed the movement of goods and people along the canal system before the widespread use of steam power, right, and diesel-powered boats. So these were some of the major infrastructural accomplishments of the Romans. We know that probably both the Pannonian and the Moesian fleets took part in Trajan's two Dacian wars of 99, 101, and 105 and 6. This is true also considering the large amount of legions, 16 at a point, involved in the Dacian wars, considered the auxiliary complement. This is important also as far as the supply lighter function, because we will see now how much grain, for example, was necessary to fully supply a legion, how much these boats also getting grain, for example, from Ukraine, and more would contribute to the Roman efforts in the Carpathian Basin. And today's video is based, in fact, on this supply lighter of the Classis Flavia Moesiaca around Trajan's time, so let's say 100 AD, right? Trajan's column, thankfully enough, shows the emperor and his army traveling down the Danube on different types of boats. We find oared warships. Actually, here there is, among the pictures after the first map, I think I inserted a riverine warship that is not, in fact, the one you see in the thumbnail, that figures instead in the other, recognizably in the other pictures. So here, of course, these lighters were just cargoes, and they, however, operated in this broader fleet, including triremes and several two-level Liburnians, even. In spite of the strategic relevance of the Danubian, that is the Pannonian and the Moesian fleets, their commanders were both of junior rank, and they were paid 60,000 sterces annually, which was less than the prefect of the Classis Germanica on the Rhine, and the reason being possibly that the Danubian fleets controlled, after all, shorter lengths of river. Indeed, the Rhine frontier was the one where most legions were concentrated. We will talk about the Classis Germanica at some other point. I already made some videos about the Batavian ships, if you're interested, not just their hijacking, in fact, of the Roman Rhine fleet, but probably the native Germanic boats that are interesting, and we'll surely come back on that naval technology evolution also towards the migration and the Viking eras. Thus, we can pass to the supply ladder as such, right? As we have observed, Trajan's columns illustrates some probably of the supply and logistic arrangements of the Roman army during the Dacian wars. And in this case, this is essentially the Moesian fleet that was based on the lower Danube, and so having actually the greater influence on the, as we've seen, especially on the Iron Gates area, and so that the most strategically and logistically relevant part. So, what is a supply ladder, right? Essentially, a ladder is a type of flat-bottomed barge used to transfer goods and or passengers to and from moored ships, most of the time, but in this case mostly because of the riverine environment where larger ships did operate, but mostly police patrolling operations were carried out, right? The reason why these fleets were there. The cargoes would be escorted also on the Danube, the Rhine, by warships. I made a video about the Roman milites classiari, that is to say an equivalent of Marines troops, and so that surely set foot on some supply ladder deck as well as a security force. The flat-bottom vessels are like that. This is what a barge is technically, used to transport these goods through inland waterways, thanks to the scarce draft, which is perfect for shallow and marshy waters. Like when we look at the base of Novi Dum and realize it's the Danube Delta, extremely marshy ground. You can imagine how it was like in the 2nd century AD, in spite of all the best Roman military engineering. That's quite a strategic area. We've seen it also in Byzantine times. All the nomadic peoples from the Eurasian steppes would pass from there. There were fortifications. It was a sort of interesting frontier at this point as well with the Sarmatians. And I made a video about actually the Pontic steppes meeting between the Sarmatians and the Romans in this kind of important frontier, when as overlooked frontier warfare. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out, right? And this ladder would be pretty much ubiquitous as the type of boat, given that pretty much it wasn't a better technology at the time to ship type to transport important amounts of supplies, as we will see now. So the supply ladder would have an open hold and be propelled by sweeps that are long, heavy oars carried before the days of auxiliary power for use when the wind failed. The latter aspect being quite relevant because on Trajan's columns no mast or sails are shown for these supply ladders, which actually would be one of the main indicators that these were sort of military boats. We can see neatly, like the drawing is, say, of the basis for the sculpture is very clear. There is a wooden cabin at the stern with a railing around the tops that the commander, whoever was in charge, could either tour around above and or stay within the cabin, while the helmsman that naturally had to be quite present, given the currents and the general skills for riverine navigation, stand on the roof of the same cabin, controlling a single long steering oar. Right, that was the major helm device. So such craft was predictably fairly slow. The crew wouldn't surpass 25 with, say, 20 oars, right? Most importantly, however, the supply lighter could carry easily 50 tons of cargo, right? So it's actually a massive amount of, we'll see now what kind of provisions for a ship that essentially was just a bit more than 20 meters long, with a beam of 6 and a draft of 2, slightly more perhaps. So this capacity of 50 tons carriage is really impressive. If you just make a quick calculation, like normally the average amount of grain provided to the Roman legionary was 830 grams. I made a video about properly Roman legionary food that you can check out in detail, and this was, of course, quite functional type of food in terms of calories, and the legionaries preferred this, just like seamen would do normally, like historically with biscuits, right? But because they were, of course, concentrated quantities of calories with very small volume and weight overall. So 50 tons of cargo, assuming that it would be completely grain sacks, right, could essentially satisfy more than a fully supplied early Roman legion, as far as food was concerned, for 2 days and a half, right? Which is pretty long. I mean, considering that these ships would go back and forth frequently, and that, of course, there was plenty of resources coming from various places, it would need a lot to supply even hundreds of thousands of troops like the Roman ones involved, for example, in the conquest of Dacia, right? But it is definitely a quick, safe way. Like carrying this by water actually takes, depending, of course, whether it's upstream or downstream, but overall, like, it's much more convenient than doing it on land through land routes, which necessarily would have arrived here. The main thing was crossing the river, but also bringing, in fact, these provisions from pretty far away places, including, as we were saying before, Crimea, for example. And you can imagine, however, hundreds of these supply lighters, again, fairly small boats, 20 meters in length, being capable of transporting really an enormous amount of essentials for Roman logistics, especially food, right? Supplies for a major campaign, which is an often overlooked aspect of the story. Carrying 50 tons by land, again, is really difficult. Here, instead, you could carry them out from hundreds of kilometers away quite easily on water, right, and in these large quantities. The Trajan column shows ships carrying both bales, probably grain sacks, like among, say, other, of course, goods, and barrels, which surely had wine or olive oil rations that were also particularly important in the Roman military. Consider that Moesia, as such, was the truly and only fertile region, agriculturally speaking, along the Danube. Right, of course, there was a harvest output also from other Danubian provinces, but first, it was not that much. And secondly, as a consequence, given that this made literally the capacity of supplying the Roman military locally more difficult, also in turn requiring more of these resources concentrated locally. Think about how hot, say, the Pannonian frontier was with the Marcomanni and the Jazyges. For the local Roman military to be fortifying and entrenching, the Pannonia is not a particularly urbanized province. Moesia is, and one of the reasons why the Romans decided to invade Dacia, aside from precious metals and the general instability caused by the Dacian incursions, is in fact that Moesia is actually an agriculturally rich area. It can support our urbanization. I made a video specifically about the two Moesiae, the two Moesian provinces, explaining there, in fact, how important the local cities were, etc. And in fact, this region would flourish, especially after the Dacian campaigns, because with the Romans having conquered all the northern part, this area was fundamentally insulated from major raids that occurred either very upstream around Singidunum, speaking of the Jazyges, and other Sarmatian peoples like closer to Noviodunum that was however more surrounded by marshes, was a sort of tougher ground, so that Moesia in its heartland would be more sheltered by that. This was a very important strategic move. And of course, the Danube is the divide between southern and central Europe. That is also a climatic divide, so importing Mediterranean products in order to supply the army more conveniently. We've seen wine, olive oil. Wine was normally very important in the Roman military as yet another source of calorie. Was conveyed normally in amphorae, commercially as well, and this was of course all one with subcontracting with civilian companies like the supplying of the army. There was a lot of improvising here at some levels. We think the early imperial times as the most functional even in absolute terms of organization. But as a matter of fact, the Romans had it easier, and so they could simply subcontract. There wasn't much of a centralized bureaucracy in these things. In fact, at some point, even the supplies of arms and armor for the Dacian invasion came from all the ones that were normally produced by the same legionnaires in other bases from other frontiers, from other provinces, just all conveying there. It's possible, however, that the army used different methods for example, conveying wine when especially large quantities were needed. We unfortunately don't know too much about this. I covered it partially in that video about the Roman army food. These supply lighters are also shown on the Trajan column carrying horses. Right, this was absolutely normal. There were specialized types of boats, ships that were devoted to horses. Transportation is something you find also during the Viking era, etc. We do not have an overwhelming evidence of this, even for such a relatively well-documented team like the Roman army. In fact, Trajan's column is basically the only evidence of this, but it was obviously there. It had always been in more complex ways than we think. The lighters could form also the supports of pontoon bridges with their decks. It would really would really do to, also support the construction of, major bridges as the one that Trajan built on the Seine Danube. They had different tasks according to the need. To make a bridge, a number of craft were moored, normal like these pontoon bridges, alongside each other across the river. Simply the bridge roadway running on piers of wood built up from the hull. The reason why before I was saying that the absence of sails is a bit the indicator of the military nature of these boats is the fact that a craft for civil use would not be built requiring expensive rowers to propel them, right? Some average boatman or merchant would have essentially used sails more frequently, was less in a hurry. He would hopefully, be out there on the river in a more peaceful setting, which there was no need, in fact, to recur to violence. At least, this Danubian frontier for centuries had been pretty violent, and it would be interesting to know anything about the, for example, Celtic or Thracian boats and how these were used in surely also some more aggressive way, but as we've seen for the Germanic or Gallic ships in another video. But this was one aspect where you needed the sailors being better trained just to keep up with the same speed. So an increased regularity, also some actual capacity to operate in combat, because anything would do, right? Another indicator of the military nature of these ships was the fact that they were more uniform in pattern. You can imagine all kinds of ships of both sizes and types differentiation by the locals in a normal context. Here you had to recognize the ship that surely also bore some specific flags. It was painted in some way, not necessarily a uniform one, right? But the structure was rather more uniform, as there was some more scientific attention to for example, the volume of the goods that they would transport for, again, a more positive handling of the calculation of the military supplies, right? As far as the colors, we do not know, because Trajan's column at least is today not displaying most of the color, but of course it would be all colored. These colors would correspond to different degrees of uniformity, symbolism, etc. Unfortunately, we know too few about this. We will talk about, in the video about the Milites Classiarii, I talked about the idea of uniformity for Marines, right? Apparently there was something about blue being out there, but not the exclusive color. The Roman army did have some level of color uniformation, but probably mostly at a unit, a cohort, or even maniple level. And yes, the maniples still existed organizationally at this time, but the general, this would be entrusted mostly to the local commanders if they had some capacity even to issue some uniforms. They would mostly provide with the dyed clothes, right? That's how it normally worked, and then the soldiers would tailor them. More than else, it was important to wear that distinctive color. Then there was an incredible degree of personalization and customization in spite of the relative uniformity of the armament. And in any case, I made a video about the Cingulum Militaris, explaining what is actually that distinguished a soldier from the rest of the people, even in a time in which, in fact, there was not much of a distinction between the military and the civilians. At least in the Roman army, there was more marked, but conceptually, right, it was something slightly different from what we conceive in modern times, right? So we do not know enough just about the same ships, hulls, for example, the cabins, colors, or whatever. We can imagine, however, pretty interesting level of decoration here. The picture I used for the thumbnail does show a bit of that, like kind of bluish color, red cabin, right? Red tunics for the owners, but it's just, some speculation from my side. So in any case, the fact that these boats belonged specifically to the fleet was self-evident, just in the whichever way they were built, colored, and more. So aside from transporting men, horses, and supplies, these guys carried the soldiers at some point, of course. The Roman riverine fleets played an important part within the same campaigns, logistics and technical, and military engineering. How? By supplying skilled craftsmen for engineering work, particularly in timber. Right? It was not just about food. That was, of course, the first concern. The strategy of these armies, like just by the size, for example, always being close to a major riverway or water pool. Like if you don't do so, like you're going to die of thirst pretty quickly, right? Think about the miracle of the rain that happened in basically today's Czech Republic, and like it's not difficult to find water in Czech Republic, but for an entire army, that is an enormous operational and logistical issue, right? It heavily affects the entire campaign. And just think the famed Roman army and its military engineering. That is essentially the Roman legionnaire just by himself was primarily an assault engineer. And Trajan times with Apollodorus of Damascus really witnessed some of the greatest infrastructural achievements of the empire, as you know, enormous feats that not even the Hellenistic powers back in the day had ever pulled off. Well, these supply lighters would carry a lot of timber, right? Because, of course, Dacia was full of wood as well, but just having it already cut in predisposed way, think about all the tools, all the whichever need, whatever could be brought, right? And mostly timber for fortifications, for building bridges, etc. The famous Roman castra in the first place, that's the hallmark of the Roman military, were supplied by these little faithful mules of the Classis Flavia Moesiaca. Speaking of river mules, and the Fabri Navales were specifically connected with the supply lighters for their work. These were essentially the naval military engineers. Right? It's just like today you go into the military academy in the Navy and you specialize in engineering, right? As a cadet to become an officer. So these were the Fabri Navales, together with, of course, the lesser ranks. And these guys made ordinary bridges as well as the pontoons that we talked about before. So they would know everything about these ships and what they could do with them. They were given an important room, also discretionally, usually to employ them, like they were responsible for, in fact, the Roman supplies, logistics through these marvels of ancient technology, infrastructure, architecture, engineering that the Romans were famous for, right? So everything concurs, right, to eventually, if you wonder how the Romans eventually managed to conquer Dacia, well, it's also thanks to these guys. As I always say, and as von Clausewitz teaches more than else, logistics is not a branch of the art of war. Logistics has nothing to do with anything military, right? People say, "Oh my God, kids think about tactics and men think about logistics." No, right? Actual men talk and think about strategy, which is not logistics, right? Even a civilian can make a logistical line work. Whether it works or not strategically is a completely different affair, right? It's just like, knowing how to build a trench. Every civilian engineer can build one, but locating it on a theater, a military theater, for a strategic purpose is a completely different thing. And that's why, in fact, you needed the military taking care of logistics in this way, because it was primarily a strategic based problem, right? And the logistics was just the material side of the story that these guys had to master, but it was about the command, what they were told, and how to practically achieve that, but also how to smoothen the process as much as they could, both strategically and logistically in their own level, right? So this is interesting because so far we made already some interesting video about Roman ships, warships mostly. We also made a video about the Roman merchantmen. So we are widening a bit in that field of ancient naval warfare. There is a lot ahead, but we also managed to couple this with the videos about the single, for example, Roman provinces. Right? I talked recently about Domitian. I also talked back in the day about Trajan. We will look, of course, in depth. We talk about Dacian warfare, but especially also made a video about Moesia, the two Moesias, and that is also useful. We talked recently also about late Roman provinces, of fact the lower Danube, from the Notitia Dignitatum, right? And so involuntarily, because I didn't plan this just as a broader thing, we have plenty of videos that, in fact, I will post in the top fixed comment as well, because everything does, right? If you want to understand bit by bit these areas, here you have all the various steps to make the entire picture clearer, I hope. And so I'm really satisfied with this work. I have to resume the series about the Roman provinces. That was pretty interesting. I haven't created a playlist yet, but it can be an idea. There is also a series about the playlist rather than about the Roman frontier, which I think is quite important, and we will keep replenishing hopefully soon. There is really a lot about Roman warfare in general. You know where to find that. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.